Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
The night a Dogman saved my life. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is the story of how a Dogman once saved my life back when I was 17 years old. It happened exactly as I'm about to describe it. That rainy night about 30 years ago changed everything I thought I knew about the world. Most people would dismiss this as teenage imagination or trauma-induced hallucination. But I was there. I felt those powerful arms lift me and my bike to safety. I looked into those intelligent, kind eyes, and I've carried the memory of that supernatural rescue with me every single day since. The evening started ordinary enough. I was cycling home from my friend's house after we'd spent hours working on a model airplane that never seemed to get finished. Dark clouds had been building all afternoon, creating that heavy electric feeling in the air that signals a serious storm is approaching. The bike trail through the woods was my usual route home, a winding path I'd traveled hundreds of times, cutting through dense oak and maple trees that formed a natural canopy overhead. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, I pedaled a bit faster, hoping to beat the worst of it. The trail felt familiar beneath my tires, every root and rock memorized from countless rides. But tonight was somehow different. The rain intensified quickly, transforming from scattered drops to a steady drumming against the leaves above. Within minutes, what had become a light sprinkle became a legitimate downpour, and I found myself squinting through the growing darkness, my clothes already soaked through. That was when I made the decision that nearly cost me my life. Instead of continuing on the muddy trail, I decided to cut over to the highway, thinking the paved road would offer better traction and visibility. It seemed logical at the time. Less mud, better lighting from the occasional street lamp, and a slightly more direct route home. I remember feeling relieved as I guided my 10-speed onto the shoulder of the highway, grateful to be on solid pavement instead of navigating increasingly treacherous trail conditions. What I hadn't counted on was how dangerous that wet asphalt could be. Within seconds of reaching the highway, I realized my terrible mistake. The rain had turned the road surface into something like an ice rink. My bike tires, which had gripped the trail reasonably well, suddenly found no purchase whatsoever on the slick pavement. I felt the peculiar, terrifying sensation of hydroplaning, that moment when you realize your vehicle is no longer in contact with the ground, when physics takes over and your input becomes meaningless. My handlebars began to shimmy violently. The bike started moving in ways that defied my steering, sliding sideways across the wet asphalt like I was riding on soap. I squeezed the brakes, but they only made things worse, causing the rear wheel to skid sideways. I felt like I was going to have a heart attack as I fought to maintain any semblance of control. But the bike seemed to have developed a mind of its own, carrying me in unpredictable directions across the rain-slicked highway. That is when I noticed the headlights behind me, growing brighter and larger in the peripheral vision allowed by the storm. The vehicle was approaching fast, its headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. At almost the same moment, I spotted another set of headlights ahead, coming from the opposite direction. I was caught directly between them, hydroplaning across the center line, with absolutely no control over my trajectory. Time seemed to slow down in that horrible way it does during life-threatening moments. I could see both vehicles clearly now. A pickup truck behind me, and what looked like a sedan coming toward me. Both drivers had probably spotted me, but on this rain-soaked highway, there was little either could do to avoid a collision. My bike continued its unpredictable slide across the wet pavement, and I realized with crystal clarity that I was about to be hit by one vehicle or the other, or maybe both. The sound of tires on wet asphalt filled my ears, mixing with the steady drumming of rain and the approaching rumble of engines. I remember thinking, this is it. This is how my 17-year-old life would end. Not from some noble cause or from a dramatic illness. and from a stupid decision to leave a bike trail for a highway. The absurdity of it struck me, even as terror filled every cell in my body. And that is when something impossible happened. From my right, from the dark woods beside the highway, came what I could only describe as a warm blanket of safety. Strong arms wrapped around me and my bike simultaneously, lifting us both clean off the pavement, with a gentleness that contradicted the supernatural strength required for such a feat. I felt myself being carried through the air at tremendous speed, the sensation both terrifying and oddly comforting, like being cradled by some benevolent giant. The rescue happened so quickly that the approaching vehicles passed through the space where I'd been sliding just seconds before. I heard their engines fade as my rescuer carried me in a smooth arc over the highway and down into the safety of the woods on the far side. The entire experience couldn't have lasted more than 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt both instantaneous and eternal. When we landed gently on solid ground, I looked up into the face of my savior, expecting to see some heroic human being who had somehow managed this impossible rescue. Instead, I found myself staring into the kind, intelligent eyes of what could only be described as a dog's face on an otherwise human-like body. The creature was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, with the muscular build of a powerful man, but covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was distinctly canine, with a long snout, alert ears, and a mouth that hung slightly open in what almost looked like a gentle pant. The most remarkable thing wasn't the creature's impossible anatomy, but the expression in its eyes. There was intelligence there, and kindness, and something that felt almost like humor, as if this being found joy in having helped someone in need. It looked down at me with what I can only describe as paternal affection, the way a loving father might look at a child he just pulled back from danger. We regarded each other in silence for what felt like a year and 6 weeks. The creature's breathing was calm and steady, showing no sign of exertion, despite having just performed an impossible feat of strength and speed. Rain continued to fall all around us, but somehow I felt completely safe in this being's presence, as if nothing in the world could harm me while it was there. Then, without a word or sound, the creature turned and began walking away on its hind legs into the dark woods. Its gait was perfectly balanced, neither fully human nor fully animal, but something altogether unique. Within moments, it had disappeared completely into the shadows between the trees, leaving me alone with my bike and the memory of the most extraordinary few minutes of my life. As I stood there in the rain, trying to process what had just happened, I realized that the creature had placed me on another bike path, one that would take me safely home without requiring me to return to the dangerous highway. My bike was completely undamaged, and remarkably so was I. Not a scratch, not a bruise, nothing to indicate I'd just been rescued for what could have been a fatal collision. I climbed back onto my bike, and I began pedaling slowly toward home, my mind reeling with questions that had no rational answers. Who or what had that creature been? How had it moved so fast? Why had it chosen to help me? The trail beneath my tires felt reassuringly solid after my terrifying experience on the wet highway, and I found myself grateful not just for the rescue, but for the reminder that sometimes the familiar path, however muddy or difficult, is the safest choice. Whenever life throws me curveballs now, I remember those kind eyes looking down at me in the rain, and I'm reminded that guardian angels don't always come in the forms we expect. Sometimes they come as impossible creatures from dark woods, beautiful monsters who ask for nothing in return, except perhaps that we remember kindness exists in places where we least expect it. We hope you enjoyed that all-new story. Get set because it's just the beginning of an hour of Dogman stories, continuing right after this word from Team Dogman.
also looks cute on girls. The hat says Dogman, I'm happy to meet you, but there's no guarantee that Dogman won't eat you. Team Dogman hat, it's the prescription. The link to get your own is in the description.
Dogman woke me from my sleep. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I remember it like it was yesterday. I opened my eyes to brown fur and amber light filtering through the canopy above. At first I thought I was still dreaming, but the smell of earth and pine needles beneath me was too sharp and too real. A massive form crouched beside me, close enough that I could see individual hairs catching the dappled sunlight. Dark fur, thick and coarse, covered arms that were too long and too large for a man but too human for a wolf. He was looking at me with eyes that held intelligence I had never seen in any animal. They were dark, almost black, set in a face that was neither fully human nor beast. His snout was elongated, but not quite a muzzle, and when he tilted his head slightly, studying me, I felt no fear. Instead, something deep inside me recognized him, although I knew we had never met. The forest around us was perfectly still. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as if the world had paused to watch this moment unfold. I should have been terrified. I should have screamed. I should have run. But lying there against the old oak's roots, with this creature watching over me, I felt safer than I had felt in years. Let me tell you how I came to be sleeping in those woods, because that part matters too. This was back in 1952, when I was 22, and working at a general store in town. I lived in a boarding house on Maple Street, nothing fancy, just a clean room with a window that faced east, so I could watch the sunrise while I pinned up my hair each morning. My grandmother lived about 3 miles out of town, just past the mill and through the woods. Grandmother was always after me to visit more often, always had some scheme or another to introduce me to this young man or that one. You're getting long in the tooth, she'd say, although 22 hardly seemed ancient to me. I've got someone I want you to meet. This particular day, she had been especially insistent. There's a nice boy coming to supper tomorrow, she told me when I'd stopped by the previous weekend. His father owns the lumber mill. He's got good prospects. You come straight after work, you hear? Don't dawdle. I had promised I would, though I wasn't particularly excited about another of her matchmaking attempts. The last one had been a fellow who spent the entire evening talking about his prized chickens and asking if I knew how to preserve eggs for winter storage. Still, I loved my grandmother, and if it made her happy to think she was helping my romantic prospects, I could endure another awkward supper. To that Friday evening, I locked up the store, and I started walking the familiar path through the forest. The path through those woods was one I had walked hundreds of times since childhood. It wound between towering oaks and maples, past a little creek that ran year-round, over a fallen log that served as a bridge, and around a clearing where wild strawberries grew in June. I knew every tree, every turn, every rock that jutted up from the earth. That evening, the forest was particularly beautiful. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating pools of golden light on the forest floor. Somewhere above me, a wood thrush was singing its song, and I could hear the creek babbling in the distance. The air smelled of growing things and rich earth, with just a hint of the wild roses that bloomed along the forest's edge. I had changed out of my work dress into something more suitable for grandmother's supper. My shoes were practical brown Oxfords, good for walking, and I carried a small cloth bag with a jar of honey I brought for her from the store. But as I walked, something felt different. My legs seemed heavier than usual, and I found myself stopping more often to catch my breath. It was strange. I was young and healthy, and this walk had never tired me before. By the time I reached the halfway point, where the old oak tree stood beside the path, I was feeling genuinely weary. This oak was really old, with a trunk so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't reach around it. Its roots created natural seats and hollows, and I had often stopped there as a child to rest during longer walks with my father. The tree felt like an old friend, solid and welcoming. I decided to sit for a few minutes. Grandmother wouldn't expect me until 6 o'clock, and I had left the store early enough to allow for the walk. I settled myself against the trunk, feeling the rough bark through the thin cotton of my dress. The roots made a comfortable backrest, and the soft earth was cushioned with years of fallen leaves. The forest sounds seemed to grow quieter as I sat there. The wood thrush finished its song, and even the creek seemed to murmur more softly. The golden light was fading to a deeper amber, and I felt my eyelids growing heavy. Just a short rest, I told myself, just enough to gather my strength for the remainder of the walk. I settled back against the oak's broad trunk and I closed my eyes, intending to rest for only a few minutes. The bark was rough against my shoulders, but in a comfortable way, like being embraced by the tree itself. I could feel the slight depression in the earth where countless other travelers had stopped over the years, finding this natural seat among the massive roots. The forest evening sounds grew softer around me. The distant creek, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the whisper of wind through the leaves overhead. I had never been one to nap during the day, always too busy with work or household tasks, but something about this place made sleep seem natural, even inevitable. I don't remember the moment I actually fell asleep. One moment I was listening to the peaceful sounds of the forest, feeling the day's warmth lingering in the air, and the next, I was drifting into the deepest, most restful sleep I could remember. There were no dreams that I recall, just a sense of floating in warm darkness, held safe by something larger than myself. When I began to wake, it was gradual, like rising slowly through deep water toward the surface. I became aware first of the earthy smell beneath me, and then of a presence nearby, patient and watchful. My eyes fluttered open fully, and there he was. Crouched beside me with the patience of someone who had been watching over me for quite some time. In the fading afternoon light, his dark fur seemed to absorb the golden rays filtering through the oak's canopy above us. It was the Dogman. He was massive. He was huge even in his crouched position. His fur was thick and coarse. The hair was longest around his neck and shoulders, creating an almost mane-like appearance that spoke of wild strength. Yet despite his size and obvious power, there was nothing threatening about his posture. He sat back on his haunches like a great dog might, his arms, for they were more arms than forelegs, resting casually on his knees. His face was the most remarkable thing about him. It was neither fully human nor completely animal, but something that seemed to bridge both worlds. His snout was elongated but not quite a wolf's muzzle, and his ears, pointed and alert, swiveled slightly as he studied me. But it was his eyes that held me captive, dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through to my soul. There was recognition there, as if he had known me long before this moment, as if our meeting were not chance but destiny. I should have been terrified. A sensible person would have screamed or fainted or tried to run. Instead, I found myself slowly sitting up straighter against the oak's trunk, never breaking eye contact with this impossible creature. Something deep in my chest told me I was safe, safer perhaps than I had ever been in my life. "Hello," I whispered, although I felt foolish the moment the word left my lips. How do you greet such a being? His head tilted slightly to one side, and I swear I saw something like amusement flicker in those dark eyes. He made no sound in response, but somehow I understood that he had heard me, that my greeting had been acknowledged and accepted. Slowly, carefully, I reached out my hand toward him. I moved as I would with any wild creature. No sudden movements, no threatening gestures. My fingers extended toward his massive head, and he leaned forward just slightly, meeting me halfway. When my fingertips touched the fur on his snout, it was softer than I'd expected, warm and surprisingly fine despite its wild appearance. He closed his eyes as I touched him, and a sound rumbled deep in his chest. Not quite a growl, but something that spoke of contentment and recognition. I grew braver, running my hand along his muzzle, over his forehead, and finally scratching gently behind one of his pointed ears. His fur was thick enough that my fingers disappeared into it, and I could feel the solid warmth of him beneath. For several minutes we stayed like that, me petting him as if he were an oversized dog, him accepting my touch with a dignity that was both animal and human. Time seemed suspended in that golden light. The forest around us remained perfectly still, as if all the woodland creatures were holding their breath, watching this impossible meeting between their world and mine. I found myself talking to him in low, soothing tones, the way I might speak to any beloved animal. "Where did you come from?" I asked softly, running my fingers through the thick fur on his neck. "Have you been watching over this place long?" He opened his eyes and looked at me with such intensity that I felt he was trying to communicate something important. His gaze moved from mine down to my hands, and then back to my eyes. There was a sadness there, ancient and deep, but also something like gratitude. I had the strangest feeling that he had been waiting for me specifically, that our paths were meant to cross in exactly this way, at exactly this moment. It made no sense, of course. I was just a shop girl walking to my grandma's house, but I don't know. What was he? Sense seemed less important than the feeling of rightness that settled over me like a warm blanket. He leaned closer, and I felt his breath on my face, warm and surprisingly sweet like meadow grass. For a moment, I thought he might speak, or might reveal the mystery of what he was and why I felt I knew him. His eyes searched mine with an intensity that made my heart race, not with fear, but with a strange sort of anticipation. And then, without warning, he pulled back slightly and turned his great head toward the forest, his ears pricking forward as if he had heard something I could not. Every muscle in his body went tense, and the peaceful atmosphere of our encounter shifted to something more urgent. He looked back at me once, and in his eyes I saw something that might have been regret, or maybe a warning. In that moment, I knew our time together was coming to an end. Although I couldn't have said how, I knew that. Suddenly the crack of a rifle shot split the forest silence like an axe through wood. The sound echoed off the trees, sharp and violent in the peaceful clearing. Every bird for a mile around must have taken flight at once, because suddenly the air was full of the thunder of wings and the harsh cries of alarm. The spell that had held the forest in hushed reverence was broken, as completely as if someone had shattered a mirror. My companion's reaction was immediate. One moment he was there beside me, solid and warm under my touch, and in the next, he was gone. Not running exactly, but flowing away from me with a speed that seemed impossible for something that big. He moved through the trees like smoke, barely disturbing the undergrowth, his dark fur allowing him to blend into shadows between the oak trees. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest, though whether from the gunshot or from losing him I couldn't say. "Wait," I called out, but he was already disappearing into the deeper woods. For just an instant, he paused and looked back at me over his shoulder. I saw in his eyes at that moment the same regret I felt in my own heart. Then he was gone, leaving only the faintest rustling of leaves to mark his passage. The forest suddenly felt ordinary again, just trees and shadows and the distant sound of someone crashing through the underbrush toward me. I stood there beside the old oak, my dress wrinkled from sleeping against the bark, my hair probably a mess, trying to convince myself that what had just happened was real. Footsteps were approaching fast now, along with a man's voice calling my name and asking if I was all right. A young man burst through the trees, rifle in hand, his face flushed from running. He was tall and lean with sandy brown hair and kind blue eyes that were wide with concern. His shirt was rumpled and damp with perspiration, and there were small tears in his sleeves from pushing through the undergrowth. He called my name again, then stopped short when he saw me standing there. "Thank goodness you're safe," I heard voices, and I thought, looking around through the clearing with sharp, searching eyes. He asked, "Was someone with you?" I could have sworn I saw. His voice trailed off as his gaze swept the forest, where my companion had disappeared. I watched his face carefully, and I could see the exact moment when his mind tried to make sense of what he had glimpsed. Something too large to be a man, too upright to be a bear, moving through the trees with impossible grace. He told me his name. He told me my grandmother sent him to find me when I didn't arrive for dinner. "You saw the creature too," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching my face. "I did see something," he admitted. "Something that shouldn't exist. But I saw it plain as day. It was crouched right beside you, and you were petting it like it was a dog." We stood there in the gathering dusk, two strangers who had shared an impossible moment. The forest around us had returned to its normal evening sounds, insects beginning their twilight chorus, an owl calling in the distance, the creek babbling over its stones. Everything was as it should be, except for the memory we both carried of something that defied explanation. We agreed not to speak of this. We agreed that no one would believe us anyway. He offered me his arm and I took it, letting him steady me as we began walking toward my grandmother's house. As we left the clearing, I looked back once at the old oak tree where I had slept, where I had touched something magical and wild. The tree stood silent and ordinary in the fading light, keeping its secrets. I never married. I did return to that oak tree many times over the years, though, especially after difficult days, or when loneliness pressed too heavily on my heart. I would sit among the roots and remember that afternoon when magic was real, and I was 22, and the world held mysteries that I could touch with my own hands. I never saw him again, my forest guardian, my impossible friend, but I felt his presence sometimes, and the way the light fell through the leaves, or in the hush that would settle over the woods when I approached the old oak. I like to think he watches over me still, just beyond the edges of sight. She's the kind of person fulfills a wish. I'm talking about our EP Patricia. Please join me in welcoming our newest channel member, Patricia Calhoun, who joined us at YouTube and gets to see our secret uncensored members-only episodes. The Dogman of Uncle Netter's farm. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I still remember my first sighting of the Dogman. I pressed my back against the chicken coop, trying to make myself smaller in the shadows. My heart hammered so hard, I was sure it would give me away. The thing stood maybe 30 yards off, right at the edge, where Uncle Netter's property met the dark woods. It was 7 feet tall easy, maybe more. Its shoulders were broader than any man's, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. But it wasn't the size that froze my blood. It was how it stood, upright on two legs like a man, but wrong somehow. Too muscular, too aware. The creature's head turned, slow and deliberate, scanning the farmyard. When those yellow eyes found me, I stopped breathing altogether. They glowed like twin lanterns in the darkness, but there was something behind that glow. Intelligence. Recognition. It knew I was there. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I wanted to do something besides stand there shaking like a fool, but my legs had turned to water. The creature tilted its massive head, studying me the way a man might study a bug he was deciding whether to step on. Its ears, pointed and too large, swiveled forward, and then it was gone. No sound, no rustling leaves. 1 second it filled my vision like a nightmare come to life, and the next, there was only empty space and the normal sounds of night insects. I stayed pressed against that coop until my legs could hold me again, wondering if I'd finally lost my mind, like my Uncle Netter's. About 4 decades back, when I was 23 and I didn't know much about anything, my folks sent me to help Uncle Netter's run his farm. Run might be too strong a word for what we were doing, more like keeping the place from falling down completely. The farm had seen better days. Paint peeled off the barn in long strips, and half the fence post leaned at angles that made no sense. Uncle Netters used to work 200 acres with hired hands and modern equipment. Now we were down to maybe 20 acres that produced anything useful. 3 cows that gave milk when they felt like it, and a dozen chickens that seemed to lay eggs out of spite. Uncle Netters himself was the main reason I was there. Farming accident 5 years prior left him in a wheelchair, proud as ever but needing help with most everything. His legs were done for, but his mind was sharp as a tack, or so I thought initially. My days started before sunrise with the animals. Fed the chickens, collect the eggs, milk the cows if they were cooperating. Then tend the vegetable patch that kept us in tomatoes, corn, and beans. Uncle Netters could still direct operations from his chair on the porch, telling me which rows needed weeding or when the corn was ready. Afternoons were for helping him with personal things, fixing his meals, making sure he took his medicine, helping him around the house. He was stubborn about accepting help, but his body didn't give him much choice. The isolation was the hardest part. Nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. Just me, Uncle Netters, and whatever creatures roamed the woods at night. And that was when Uncle Netters would start telling me about the beast. Every single evening, as soon as the sun touched the horizon, Uncle Netters would wheel himself around the house checking locks. Front door, back door, even the windows that hadn't been opened in years. He'd pull the curtains tight and double-check that his shotgun was loaded and within reach of his bed. "You mark my words, boy," he'd say, fingers drumming on the wheelchair arms. "That devil's spawn walks these woods after dark. Been hunting this land for years, waiting for the right moment." I'd nod and make agreeable sounds, but inside I was thinking Uncle Netters had finally gone around the bend. Old folks living alone too long sometimes get strange ideas. Kinda made sense to me he'd start seeing monsters in every shadow. He'd point to deep scratches on the barn siding, gouges that ran too high for any normal animal to make. "See them claw marks? That's from its hands. Got thumbs like a man, but claws like the devil itself." I figured those scratches came from bears or maybe wild dogs. We had both roaming around, and an old barn made easy pickings for any animals looking for shelter or food. But Uncle Netters wasn't having any rational explanations. He'd sit by his bedroom window some nights, shotgun across his lap, watching the tree line like he expected an army to come marching out. The smallest sound, an owl hooting, a branch scraping the roof, would have him wheeling around the house, checking and rechecking those locks. "It knows we're here," he'd say, eyes wide with genuine terror. "It watches the house. It's waiting for one of us to make a mistake." The fear in his voice was real enough. Whatever Uncle Netters thought was out there, he believed in it completely. I just figured his mind was going the way minds sometimes do when bodies fail and loneliness sets in. I figured Uncle Netters was Uncle Nutters. But looking back, I should have listened closer to what he was trying to tell me. About 3 weeks later, I was heading out to check on the chickens. They'd been restless all evening, squawking and carrying on like something had them spooked. Uncle Netters was already asleep, snoring in his chair by the window where he dozed off keeping watch. The air was cool for a summer, with a breeze that should have felt good after the day's heat. But instead, something felt wrong. Too quiet. Even the insects had stopped their usual nighttime sounds. I was halfway to the chicken coop when I saw it. The creature stood between the barn and the woods, perfectly still in the moonlight. My first thought was that someone was playing a joke, maybe a man in a costume trying to scare us. But no costume could make shoulders that broad, or arms that long. No man stood 7 feet without seeming stretched thin. This thing was built like a mountain, given shape and covered in dark fur. Its chest rose and fell with steady breathing. Real breathing. The fur moved in the breeze, and I caught a smell like wild animals mixed with something else, something that made my skin crawl. But it was the hands that convinced me this wasn't anything natural. They hung at its sides, too large and ending in claws that caught the moonlight. But they had thumbs, working thumbs, that moved independent of the fingers, just like Uncle Netters had said. The creature's head turned toward me with deliberate slowness, those yellow eyes fixed on mine, and I felt like a rabbit staring down a wolf. There was intelligence there, purpose. It knew exactly what it was looking at. We stared at each other for what felt like hours. Then, it took one step back toward the woods, never breaking eye contact. Another step. Then it simply melted into the shadows, like it had never been there at all. I ran back to the house on legs that barely held me, fumbling with the lock and slamming the door behind me. My hands shook so bad, I could barely turn the deadbolt. Uncle Netters was still asleep in his chair, shotgun across his lap, completely unaware that everything he'd been warning me about was absolutely true. I spent the rest of that night sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was working too hard. Maybe the isolation was getting to me the same way it had gotten to Uncle Netters. But I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes, the way they'd looked right through me, calculating, aware. Morning came eventually. I went through the motions of feeding the animals and collecting eggs, but my heart wasn't in it. Every shadow made me jumpy. Every sound from the woods had me looking over my shoulder. Uncle Netters noticed it right off. "You look like you've seen a ghost, boy. Something keeping you awake?" I hemmed and I hawed through breakfast, not sure how to tell him. Uncle Netters had been telling me about the creature for months, but admitting I'd seen it felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Finally, I just came out with it. "Uncle Netters, I think I saw your beast last night." He set down his coffee cup and stared at me. "You think? Or you know?" "I know." The words came easier once it started. I told him everything. The size, the eyes, the way it moved. The hands with their working thumbs. Uncle Netters listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his wheelchair and he let out a long breath. "I've been trying to tell you for 2 years," he said quietly. "I figured you thought I was crazy." "I did think that. I'm sorry," I told him. He waved off my apology. "I can't say I blame you. It does sound crazy. But now you've seen it yourself." He looked out the window toward the woods. "Been haunting this land since before I was born. My daddy saw it. His daddy before him. Always the same creature. Never aging. Never leaving." "What do you think it wants?" Uncle Netters was quiet for a long moment. "Nothing good." In August, heat settled over the farm like a wet blanket that wouldn't lift. At 2 in the afternoon, the air shimmered off the barn roof and even the chickens had given up moving around. I finished my morning chores early, and Uncle Netters was napping in his chair, so for once I had some time to myself. I remembered a small swimming hole from my childhood visits, just a bend in the creek where the water pooled deep enough for cooling off. It was somewhere past our property line back in the woods that Uncle Netters always warned me to avoid. But that day the heat was making me stupid, and I figured a quick walk to find that creek wouldn't hurt anything. I grabbed a mason jar for water, and I headed toward the tree line. The woods felt different in daylight, still thick and shadowy, but normal somehow. Birds called from the branches overhead. Squirrels chattered at me for disturbing their territory. My boots crunched through dead leaves and fallen branches as I pushed deeper, looking for any sign of moving water. I'd been walking maybe 20 minutes when I heard it, a crashing sound like something big moving fast through the underbrush. Before I could even turn around, a feral hog burst from a thicket, not 10 feet away. This thing was massive, had to weigh 300 pounds, with bristles standing up along its back, and small, mean eyes that fixed on me like I'd personally insulted its mother. Tusks curved up from its lower jaw, yellow and sharp as knives. I had startled it somehow, and now it was mad. The boar lowered its head and charged. I threw myself sideways, scrambling toward the nearest climbable tree, an old oak with branches low enough to reach. My boots slipped on the loose dirt as I hauled myself up, bark scraping my hands raw. The hog slammed into the trunk below me, shaking the entire tree. I climbed higher, heart hammering, while it circled underneath like it had all day to wait me out. As the sun started sinking, I realized I might be in real trouble. The boar had been pacing around my tree for near an hour when the woods went quiet. Not the good quiet of a peaceful evening, but the bad quiet that meant something dangerous was coming. It stepped out of the shadows like it owned the place. The Dogman. It moved more quickly than anything that size should be able to. 7 feet of muscle and fur, but silent as smoke between the trees. The boar sensed it first, stopped its pacing and turned toward the newcomer with a snort that sounded almost nervous. What happened next still gives me chills. The creature didn't attack or threaten. It just stood there, perfectly still, and it stared at that hog. The message was clear as spoken words. You don't belong here anymore. The boar, mean as it was, knew when it was outmatched. It backed away slow at first, then turned and crashed off through the underbrush like the devil itself was chasing it. Then, the dogman looked over at me. Those yellow eyes found mine through the oak leaves, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Not hunger, not anger, but something almost like concern. It raised one massive hand, and they were hands, no mistaking it, with working thumbs and everything, and it pointed away from the tree, and then it pointed toward where I knew Uncle Netter's house sat beyond the woods. Go home, that's what it was telling me. Get out of here while you can. The creature held my gaze for another moment, then melted back into the forest, without a sound. I sat in that tree for 10 more minutes, making sure it was really gone, before I climbed down on shaking legs. The walk home felt like it took forever. Uncle Netters was waiting on the porch when I got back, worry creasing his face. Where you been, boy? Sun's near down. I told him everything. About the woods, the boar, and most importantly about how the dogman had saved my life. I expected him to be relieved, maybe even grateful that I'd made it home safe. Instead, his face went white as fresh paint. It helped you? His voice came out like a croak. Yes, sir, it chased off that hog and showed me which way to go. Uncle Netters gripped the arms of his wheelchair so tight, his knuckles went bloodless. Boy, don't you understand what that means? I didn't, and I told him so. Good Christian folks don't get help from demons, he said, his voice rising. If that thing aided you, it means you're marked. It means you're chosen for something unholy. The accusation hit me like a slap. Uncle Netters, I didn't ask for its help. I was stuck up in a tree, and it happened to come along. He wheeled his chair closer, eyes wild with fear and something that looked like disgust. Nothing about that creature happens by chance. It's been watching you, boy. Probably watching you since you got here. And now, it's decided you belong to it. I tried to argue. I tried to make him see reason. But Uncle Netters was past listening. In his mind, accepting help from the dogman made me as corrupted as the creature itself. You gotta leave, he said finally. I can't have someone marked by Satan living under my roof. I'll call your cousin Tommy to come help me instead. Uncle Netters, please, I'm the same person I was this morning. No, he said, turning his wheelchair toward the house. You ain't. I packed my things that night with a heavy heart. Tommy arrived the next day, and I was gone by noon, driving away from the only place that had felt like home in years. Uncle Netters passed on 2 years later. Tommy said it was peaceful. His heart gave out in his sleep. But I always wondered if he spent those last months still watching the woods, still afraid of what walked there in the darkness. Looking back now, I feel I understand Uncle Netters better than I did then. I don't think he was a cruel man, or a foolish one. He was scared, and his fear was tangled up in faith in ways I couldn't untangle for him. In his world, good and evil were clear-cut things, and accepting help from something he believed was demonic meant I'd crossed a line that there was no coming back from. Maybe he was right. Maybe there are forces in this world that decent folks shouldn't traffic with, even when they seem helpful. Or maybe sometimes the line between good and evil isn't as clear as we'd like it to be. I've learned to live with questions instead of answers. Some mysteries are bigger than our need to understand them. The experience did change me, though. It made me more open to possibilities I couldn't explain. More willing to listen when old folks talk about things that don't fit into tidy boxes. And more grateful for help, wherever it comes from. These days I drive past the old farm sometimes when work takes me that way. The house stands empty now, windows boarded up, and weeds growing tall in what used to be Uncle Netter's vegetable patch. Tommy sold it after the funeral to some city folks who talked about renovating, but they never followed through. The woods have crept closer to the buildings. In another few years, they'll swallow the place entirely. Whether the Dogman still walks those woods, I wouldn't be able to say. Part of me hopes it moved on to somewhere quieter, somewhere it won't frighten old men or complicate the lives of folks just trying to get by. But sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I find myself listening to the darkness beyond my windows. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of respectful attention. The world holds more mysteries than we can understand, and some of those mysteries might be watching us back. I tell my own children to listen when their elders share stories that sound impossible. Not everything that sounds crazy is crazy, and not everything we can't explain should be dismissed. Uncle Netters taught me that, even though it cost us both more than either of us wanted to pay. Some lessons are worth the price, even when they break your heart. There's no channel member greater than him. I'm talking about Godzilla Tim. Please join me in welcoming Godzilla Tim Walker back into the membership as he just rejoined at the $10 level a couple of days ago. Godzilla Tim has been with us since back in the early days, and this episode was made possible thanks to him. Thank you, Godzilla Tim. We wouldn't know how to do the show without you. Dogman. On Long Island. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Some memories refuse to fade, no matter how many decades pass or how desperately you try to rationalize them away. I'm 62 now, with graying temples and reading glasses perched on my nose, but I can still smell the pine needles from that night when I was 17, when I had my personal experience with the Dogman. I can still see those amber eyes reflecting our headlights. I can still feel my heart beating in my chest like a caged bird. The thing is, what my friend Buddy and I witnessed shouldn't have been possible. Not there. Not in that tiny patch of scrubland on Long Island's North Shore. The Rocky Point State Pine Barrens Preserve covers maybe 100 acres, a postage stamp combined to the huge size of New Jersey's Pine Barrens that haunted our childhood imaginations. It's a modest preserve, really, squeezed between suburban developments and the Long Island Sound, where families come to hike the nature trails and kids build forts from fallen branches. But to us growing up in the 1970s, those 100 acres might as well have been the Amazon rainforest. We had discovered the preserve when we were 8, drawn by the name alone, Pine Barrens. The very words conjured images of the legendary New Jersey wilderness where the Jersey Devil was said to roam, that horse-headed, bat-winged creature that had terrorized the region for centuries. Our little Long Island preserve wasn't the real Pine Barrens, but we sure could pretend it was. This little local forest in our neighborhood, with its scrub pines and sandy soil, bore enough resemblance to the New Jersey Pine Barrens to fuel our young fantasies. We'd spend hours after school crashing through the underbrush, pretending to flee from the Jersey Devil, our sneakers kicking up clouds of pine needles and sand. The preserve became our private kingdom of monsters and mysteries, a place where the impossible felt tantalizingly close. Our Jersey Devil games started simple enough. We'd race through the trails, taking turns between who played the monster and who played the terrified witness. Buddy had this incredible ability to make the most blood-curdling screams. He'd disappear into the underbrush and then let loose with these howls that would send shivers through me even though I knew it was just him. I was better at the mythology and the lore, spinning elaborate backstories about why the Jersey Devil had migrated north to Long Island, what it ate, where it nested. The summer we turned 14, we discovered the old fire roads that cut deeper into the preserve than the public trails. These narrow dirt paths, barely wide enough for a Park Service truck, led to sections of the woods that felt genuinely wild. The trees grew thicker there, the undergrowth more tangled, and the familiar sounds of suburban life, lawnmowers, car engines, barking dogs, well, they faded to distant whispers. It was back in these hidden corners that we had our first truly unsettling experience. We had been following a particularly overgrown fire road when we heard something large moving through the trees parallel to our path. Not the scurrying of a squirrel or the fluttering of a bird, but something substantial, something that moved with purpose and intelligence. We froze, straining to see through the dense pine needles, but whatever it was, stayed out of our sight. The sound followed us for maybe 50 yards before vanishing completely, leaving us standing in the sudden silence with our hearts racing. We never saw what it was, but the encounter changed something fundamental in how we approached that preserve. The games were over. From then on, we felt like we were hunting for something real. By the time we reached our late teens, my grandfather had passed on and left me his 1982 Honda Civic hatchback, a rust-colored beast with a tendency to stall at traffic lights, and a radio that only picked up AM stations. But it was freedom, and more importantly, it was transportation back to the preserve after dark. The idea came to me on a particularly boring Friday night in October. We were seniors, facing the looming reality of college applications and adult responsibilities, when I called Buddy with a proposition that would have made our 12-year-old selves dizzy with excitement. "Remember how we always used to talk about spending a night in the Pine Barrens?" I asked him. "Like really in there, not just until sunset." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You mean actually do it? Drive in there at night?" "Why not? We're 18. I've got a car. We could park back on one of those fire roads and just, see what happens." The plan came together quickly. We'd drive out after dinner, park deep in the preserve, and then spend a few hours embracing the spooky atmosphere we'd loved as kids. It would be nostalgic, maybe a little silly, but also genuinely thrilling in a way that nothing else in our suburban lives offered. I spent the week preparing with the same methodical intensity I'd brought to our childhood expeditions. I packed my grandmother's old hot plate, the kind with the coil heating element that could plug into a car's cigarette lighter. Hot dogs seemed like the perfect camping food, easy to cook and satisfying. I threw in a pot for boiling water, paper plates, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a thermos of coffee my mother had made for us. The night itself was perfect for our purposes, overcast and unseasonably warm for October, with that heavy electric feeling that comes after a storm. We'd met at my house just after 8, when the sun had fully set, and the suburban streets were settling into their evening routine. The drive to the preserve took 20 minutes maybe, through increasingly dark and winding roads. As we left the well-lit suburban streets behind, I felt that familiar thrill of stepping outside the ordinary world. The preserve's entrance was unmarked except for a small wooden sign that was barely visible in our headlights. I turned onto the first fire road I could find, a narrow dirt track that led deeper into the woods than I'd ever driven before. The Honda's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the ghostly trunks of pine trees and the occasional flash of animal eyes in the underbrush. We drove for maybe 10 minutes before I found a small clearing where I could park without blocking the road. The silence when I turned off that engine was absolute. No traffic, no suburban sounds, just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a night bird. "Well," I said, opening the driver's door and stepping into the cool night air, "here we are." We opened the hatchback and arranged our supplies on the lowered rear door. The hot plate plugged easily into the car's power outlet, and soon we had a pot of water heating while we sat on the edge of the hatchback, our legs dangling into the darkness. The familiar ritual of cooking hot dogs felt absurdly normal, given our exotic location. We were just two teenagers having a late-night snack, but the darkness pressing in around our small circle of light made everything feel charged with possibility. This was it, the culmination of a decade of childhood dreams and teenage dares. We had no idea that something was already watching us from the tree line, waiting for the right moment to step into our light. You know how certain moments in life feel like they're happening in slow motion, every detail burned into your memory with crystalline clarity? That's how I remember the next hour unfolding. The hot plate's electric coil glowed red-orange in the darkness, casting dancing shadows across our faces as we waited for the water to boil. The smell of pine sap hung heavy in the air, mixed with that distinctive October scent of dying leaves and approaching winter. We were just two kids playing at being grown-ups, cooking hot dogs in the wilderness like we were seasoned outdoorsmen, instead of suburban teenagers whose biggest survival challenge was usually finding parking at the mall. The water started bubbling. I dropped 4 hot dogs into the pot, watching them bob and spin in the roiling water, while Buddy rummaged through our supplies for the mustard and ketchup packets we'd grabbed from the 7-Eleven. The normalcy of it all was almost comical. Here we were, deep in the Pine Barrens, on a mission to commune with the supernatural, and we were worried about condiments. "Remember when we used to think the Jersey Devil lived in these pines?" Buddy asked, gesturing toward the darkness beyond our headlights. "We must have left him like 50 peanut butter sandwiches over the years." We were laughing about our childhood obsessions when the first unusual sound reached us. It was subtle at first, a soft rustling in the underbrush that didn't quite match the rhythm of wind through pine needles. The kind of sound you notice without really noticing, like when someone's watching you from across a crowded room. I turned down the radio, and we both listened, but the forest had gone silent, except for the gentle bubbling of our hot dogs. Even the night birds had stopped calling. "It's probably just a deer," Buddy said, but his voice had dropped to a whisper. And that's when the feeling hit me, that primitive, hair-raising sensation that every human recognizes on an instinctual level. We were being watched, not by a deer or a raccoon or any mundane forest creature, but by something that was studying us with focused intelligence, something that was deciding whether we were a threat or prey. Our hot dogs were ready, but neither of us moved to remove them from the pot. We sat there on the edge of the hatchback, our feet dangling into the darkness, straining to hear past the electric hum of the hot plate. But then we did hear it, a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was breathing. Deep, measured respirations coming from somewhere just beyond the reach of our headlights. Not the quick panting of a dog or the snuffling of a bear, but something else entirely. Something that breathed like a person, but was clearly much larger than any human. Buddy's hand gripped my forearm so tightly I could feel his fingernails digging into my skin. The breathing stopped. For maybe 30 seconds the forest was absolutely silent, except for the sound of our own racing hearts. And then at the very edge of our vision, something moved. A shadow shifted between the pine trees, too tall and too broad to be human, but moving with an unmistakably bipedal gait. My first thought was bear. Black bear weren't uncommon on Long Island, and they could certainly walk upright when they wanted to. But as the shape moved closer to the tree line, I realized the proportions were all wrong. Too lean for a bear, too tall for a person, with limbs that seemed slightly too long for its body. "Do you see it?" I whispered. Buddy nodded, his eyes fixed on the moving shadow, and he asked, "What is that?" The creature, and by now I was certain it was a creature, not just our imagination, stepped to the very edge of the trees. Our headlights caught the reflection of its eyes first, two amber orbs that seemed to glow with their own inner light. And then, slowly, deliberately, it took another step forward, into the light. I've spent 45 years trying to find words that adequately describe what we saw that night. Picture a German shepherd, but scaled up to the size of a black bear. The head was unmistakably canine, pointed ears, elongated snout, intelligent eyes, but the body was wrong. Too muscular, too humanoid in its posture. It stood fully upright on its hind legs, probably 7 feet tall, with arms that hung at its side like a human's. But it was the hands that made my world tilt on its axis. Not paws. Hands. Elongated, almost human-like hands, with what appeared to be opposable thumbs. "Oh no," Buddy breathed. "Oh no." The creature stood there for what felt like hours, studying us with those glowing amber eyes. There was an intelligence there that was absolutely unmistakable. This wasn't some mindless beast driven by instinct. This was something that was thinking, evaluating, making conscious decisions about how to proceed. That's when I did something that still makes me question my own sanity. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was some misguided attempt to communicate, but I reached into our pot of hot dogs, I fished one out with a plastic fork, and I tossed it toward the creature. The hot dog landed a little past halfway between us and the tree line, steaming in the cool night air. The creature's head tilted slightly like a curious dog, and then moving with surprising speed for something so large. It moved forward. When it reached the hot dog, it stopped and looked directly at us. And then, slowly, it crouched down and reached out with one of those impossible hands. The moment its fingers, and they were definitely fingers, not claws, wrapped around that hot dog, I knew we were witnessing something that would change everything. This wasn't a bear or a wolf or any other known animal. This was something that shouldn't exist, standing 15 feet away from us in a tiny preserve on Long Island, delicately picking up a hot dog using its opposable thumb. I thought about all those childhood books I'd read about cryptids and mysterious creatures. The Michigan Dogman, the Beast of Bray Road, the countless eyewitness accounts of bipedal canines roaming the American Midwest. But we weren't in Michigan or Wisconsin. We were in New York, in a preserve that was barely large enough to support a family of squirrels, let alone something like this. The creature examined the hot dog for a moment, then took a bite. It chewed thoughtfully, its amber eyes never leaving our faces. Then, it straightened up, looked at us one more time, and took a step backward. Within seconds, it had melted back into the darkness as silently as it had appeared, leaving us sitting there in the glow of our headlights with our mouths hanging open and our entire understanding of reality crumbling around us. The first thing that hit me was the silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the presence of silence. Thick, oppressive, like the world itself was holding its breath. Even the hot plate had stopped bubbling. Buddy was the first to break the spell. "Tell me you saw that," he said, his voice shaking. "Tell me you saw that thing." "Oh, I saw it." My own voice sounded strange to my ears, like it was coming from someone else's throat. "I saw it take the hot dog. I saw those hands." "Those weren't paws," Buddy said, restating the obvious because sometimes the obvious is the only thing that makes sense. "Those were hands, with fingers and thumbs." We sat there in the glow of the headlights, trying to process what we'd just witnessed. The logical part of my brain was working overtime, cycling through every possible rational explanation. Maybe it was a person in a costume. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion created by shadows. Maybe we both imagined it. But I could still smell the musky animal odor that the creature had left behind. I could still see the place in the dirt where the hot dog had landed. And most convincing of all, I could still feel the intelligence in those amber eyes, the unmistakable sense that we'd been evaluated by something that was far more than an animal. "What the hell was that thing?" Buddy asked. I realized he was asking the same question I'd been asking myself. "I don't know." I turned off the hot plate with trembling hands. But it wasn't from here. It couldn't be from here. That was the first thing that struck me as we began to recover from the shock. The creature we'd just encountered matched descriptions I'd read of the Michigan Dogman, the Beast of Bray Road, the various bipedal canines reported through the American Midwest. But we were in New York, on Long Island, in a preserve that was a tiny fraction of the size of the forest where these creatures were supposed to be living. "Maybe it's lost," Buddy suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe it wandered here from somewhere else." "From where? The nearest forest that could support something like that is hundreds of miles away, and how would it get here? Swim across the Long Island Sound?" We discussed maybe it came from Plum Island, but even that was kind of too far away. We packed up our supplies in record time. We were driven by a sudden urgent need to get back to the familiar world of streetlights and suburban safety. The hot dogs went uneaten, the coffee untouched. All I wanted was to put distance between us and whatever was lurking in those pine trees. The drive home was a blur of conspiracy theories and frantic attempts at rationalization. Maybe it was an escaped zoo animal. Maybe it was some kind of government experiment. Maybe we'd witnessed a hoax, although I couldn't imagine how anyone could have pulled off such an elaborate deception. But with each mile we put between ourselves and the preserve, the experience felt less real, more like something that had happened to someone else. By the time we reached Buddy's house, We were already beginning to question our own memories. We both saw the same thing, right? He asked as he got out of the car. The hands, the way it moved, everything? Yeah, I said we both saw it. As I drove home through the empty suburban streets, I found myself checking the rear view mirror obsessively, half expecting to see amber eyes reflecting my taillights. But there was nothing behind me except darkness and the familiar glow of streetlights. I spent the rest of the night lying awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. The creature's face kept flashing through my mind. Those intelligent eyes, the way it had studied us, the deliberate care with which it had picked up that hot dog. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been some kind of hallucination. But then the phone rang, and Buddy's voice on the other end confirmed that our shared delusion was all too real. I keep thinking about the size of that preserve, he said without preamble. It's what, 100 acres? How could something like that live there without being seen? It was a question that would haunt me for the next 45 years. The Rocky Point Pine Barrens simply aren't large enough to support a breeding population of dogmen that size. They aren't isolated enough to hide them from the hundreds of hikers and nature enthusiasts who visit it every year, and they certainly aren't connected to any larger wilderness area where such creatures might originate, which left us with no explanations for what we had witnessed. She's a friend of the channel beyond compara. Of course, I'm talking about Megara. Please join me in thanking Fraggy Megara for her generous surprise donation to us using our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. That donation made this episode possible. In return, Fraggy gets to see our secret uncensored members-only Dogman stories. Thank you so much, Fraggy M. To find out the many different ways you can help to keep this channel alive, listen to our TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Oh, Henry.
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.